Hello. So I'm Ashwin Mehta, and I specialize in AI and advanced technologies for human capital, so including learning and development and things like that. And I have the pleasure today to be talking with Jacqui Woodall, who is a similar specialist, but in a very different sector. So Jacqui works in the legal sector. Jacqui, welcome.
Hi, Ash. So good to be here. Thanks for having me. So I am actually a human resources specialist by history, by background. I have worked in consulting, in human capital consulting for a long time. And so with an HR background, MCIPD, I focus on the people side of change. I'm now very much more a specialist in the strategic change management side, the people side of change when it comes to big transformations and also smaller incremental changes that people have to make from a human behavioral management perspective. So I was at the Big Four for a long time doing consulting, and now I'm out on my own, helping leaders to grapple with what this all means, AI and generative AI in particular for law firms. That's my particular specialism.
Yeah, love it. And this is something that we share. So I also came from Big Four, and now I'm out on my own with my own company doing my own thing. So it's a very liberating and freeing kind of
Yes, it is.
situation to be in, right?
Yeah.
So let's get into the meat of it. So today I would like to really have a good chat around this idea of AI in law. So I've seen on various social media platforms as I've been researching generative AI for human capital space. I've seen quite a lot of adverts, Instagram, LinkedIn posts on things like GPT for law and how AI is revolutionizing the legal industry. And of course, most of my work is in human capital. And the approach that I tend to take is looking at strategic purpose. So thinking about what business problems are we trying to solve, and then how can we apply human capital or technology to those problems to try and ensure competitive advantage for the business that is looking at AI. And it could be AI, it could be any number of other technologies that we could use. But when I think about this in learning and development or in human capital, I try and first of all nail down what is the problem that we're trying to solve and what's the purpose against which we would start to deploy some technology. So, in your experience with what we've been talking about in the legal space, what are the key problems that businesses are trying to solve?
Big issue that's facing the legal industry at the moment is that well, let me just take London and the UK market for an example. We're looking at a profession that has been largely, uh, the status quo has remained for 40 years, pretty much in terms of the business model and how they basically operate. And it hasn't been challenged up until now because so much of this rich knowledge and expertise has been sitting with, in law firms and with solicitors who've been building up a certain practice over years and years and years, and it's all in their brains and it's all in their own particular firm's IPs. And now we're in a totally different world where there's this proliferation of modular SaaS technology that is attempting to use generative AI tools and models and put their spin on it in a way that chunks up legal tasks and really makes it easy for the automation of specific types of work. So it is causing a real sense of threat to the way in which lawyers are used to operating. Now, it hasn't affected yet the broad scope of the way private practice law firms work. But it will not take very long before it's going to have more of a practical day-to-day impact on the business model, the way law firms are hiring. It's already impacting the way that they're hiring and running their people processes. And a key factor here is how law firms are led. It is my opinion that law firms generally are struggling for the right type of leadership skills. What is required is an agile mindset and a new way of operating that can really help people to navigate what is a very uncertain world now. And the old sort of very hierarchical ways of working where decision making is very much kept to but a few powerful people, and it's becoming untenable. I'm coming at this from a very much a human lens, so it's always about the human centric perspective. There are ways in which innovation can be much greater, harnessed for the benefit of the business if people are on board in the right way, and if people are able to approach new ways of working from less of a sense of fear and more a sense of openness and the ability to turn disruption into opportunity.
It's quite interesting. You've said a couple of things there which really, I reflect and I resonate with. And one of those things is, and my first career was in chemistry, so in science, and I was in a medical research company for a while as well. And in both of those areas, and it seems like you're saying something very similar for the legal sector, that if I'm a scientist, I'm a pretty good scientist. Maybe I have a bunch of papers and I make some scientific impact. And as I do that, I end up in a leadership position where I'm managing people. And the skill sets of being a great scientist and being a great people leader are very different. And it's the same in engineering. I'm a great engineer. I'm now a principal engineer. Now I lead people. A different skill set. And it sounds like you're saying something very similar for the legal sector. Is that right?
I'm saying something very similar. And it was okay for law firms to operate in that way because the structures and the challenges, the market challenges and the forces around them were such that actually it could be contained within quite a hierarchical structure. And has been very lucrative, is still quite lucrative, obviously for lawyers, especially in corporate worlds, at the moment. What we're seeing now is the repetition, and what still remains is an old model for what leadership looks like. And yes, you're absolutely right. What makes a leader in a law firm, an equity partner at a senior level within a private practice law firm successful is that they have proven themselves to be excellent at handling work for clients. And I mean, increasingly, there is a bit more delineation between those who become real technicians and those who are not necessarily brilliant at client facing. But I'd say there are some that obviously are very powerful within their organizations that are very good at client facing, but may also not be the best internal people leaders. So we've got all sorts of different angles that we're coming at this from. What does, excellent people leadership mean in a new era of generative AI within law firms? I have my views on that. It's not matching with what I see on the ground. There is definitely still, I think, a lack of people being equipped to be able to really help their people navigate these new waters. Yeah. Yes, because they're lawyers. They're brilliant at doing the old version of what law was, but not necessarily at what the new world requires. And I don't have the answers about what those requirements are actually necessarily, but I have some ideas about the core skill sets that are required to help navigate those waters.
So if we think about that in the context of what you originally said, and I said there were a couple of things that made me reflect. So the other thing that you said was around the idea of automation or AI workflows and handling routine tasks. So those routine tasks could be a wide variety of things. But if we think about a typical lawyer, solicitor, their workload is going to be just, I'm guessing, but just like everybody else in every other industry, there are going to be things that are value add that require that expert judgment. And there are going to be things that are routine administrative tasks or maybe some rudimentary data analysis or things that could potentially be given over to an agent or a workflow or some kind of orchestration of process. So when we think about exactly what you're saying, what is the role of the future? What does the workforce shape need to look like to deliver what lawyers do? When we think about that in the context of both the idea of leadership skills and what the future of that looks like, and the potential of AI to handle vast quantities of data and vast quantities of routine tasks, does that give us any kind of hint as to what the lawyer of the future, equipped with generative AI, might look like?
Yes. To me, this isn't necessarily rocket science, right? Because to me, there is a reality that's out there right now that, most big firms are already engaging with, whether it be e-discovery tools or due diligence tools or contract drafting tools, contract management tools. There's just so many out there. You take any type of law that has had some kind of repetitive process-driven element to it. It is already being automated, whether it be the traditional machine learning or even other types of traditional automation. Or most certainly most of them now within AI powered element to them. That's already happening. What I will focus on to try and address your question is, how are we best harnessing those tools? At the moment, what we're struggling with within law firms is an idea of how to harness the expertise and the knowledge of multidisciplinary experts to actually be able to break down how to think through the processes at both an organization-wide level, and how do we create integrated solutions? How do we actually weave everything together in a way that it makes it seamless? There is an incredibly siloed approach within most practice groups within law firms, and this is one of the key challenges that, generally speaking, they don't necessarily talk to each other. Processes, even in, really esteemed organizations, aren't necessarily particularly well documented or thought through with the current landscape in mind. And so there is a real need to involve multidisciplinary experts to really look at what the needs of the future are, map out what do these processes need to look like. How can they be modular? How can we make it so that we don't have a situation where we have certain processes that we've got ourselves stuck in a rut and we can't ever change them? We need to build in adaptability, flexibility, and a really strong sense of rigor around even just the basics around scope, statements of work, and how do we quantify them? How do we begin to measure the concept of measurement and continuous improvement is just really quite new to lawyers. They have had very simple ways of measuring output. It's been the billable hour for so long. You've got certain hierarchy of legal expertise. Obviously, you've got your NPS scores from clients, but it's really the billable hour. We make our revenue by charging a certain amount. We can measure it by how many hours. This is a totally different world now in terms of how different models of how clients will be expecting work to be chunked up and how they will be expecting to pay for work, and what does value mean to them. It's a whole new world for how law firms need to approach the business of law.
So there seems to be an obvious point there around education. So not only the education of the people who are in law firms who may be implementing some of these things, or maybe innovating around process, or innovating around how they consider billable hours or what value they deliver to clients. But there's possibly also a customer or client education piece where, as they become more knowledgeable about what the capabilities are of AI, what they can get directly from the internet, or what they can get directly in terms of advice from, and I'm not stating by any means that one should get advice from ChatGPT, but let's face it, we know people will usually go onto something like this, go on to do a Google search, or Bing, or search engine of your choice, or ChatGPT or AI agents of your choice, and go and ask it before probably they go and engage with a solicitor. So if folks are doing that, their education level,
they've got lawyers in their pockets,
Yeah, exactly.
Who's
so they
to say
know
exactly
more.
The quality of the law that they're getting, but they're getting legal advice from their pockets, right?
But whether the advice is correct or whether the clients are educated in the law is one thing. But the other thing is how educated the clients are in their expectation of what can be done with artificial intelligence, because they will expect that the more forward-thinking or the better solicitors should already be using the types of technology that one has at one's fingertips. So there's a client education piece and potentially a solicitor education piece as well around skills and what do we know about AI. That kind of leads to this idea of potentially two ideas. So one is skills literacy, AI literacy, data literacy, and all of the things that need to come together for a law firm to be able to maximize the value they get from AI. But the other side of it is the governance side. So how does one appropriately implement some technologies for the sake of increasing value or maximizing competitive advantage or increasing some of the metrics that we might look at? So sales, revenue, volume, all of these things. So if we have a chat about both of those things, because in my world, in the human capital space and learning, some of these things are potentially the same as they would be for any other sector.
Yes.
So let's talk about governance.
Just a little bit more stark, I would say, in the legal world. Yeah, I think the level of conservatism and risk aversion is such that there has been traditionally a a lack of readiness, or certainly a reticence around automation and around modernization. That is a theme that I've definitely seen. So your question is about governance, and we could talk about a lot of the technical and structural aspects of governance, but obviously I'm here talking from a people lens, a leadership lens, mindset lens. If I think about the kind of primary barriers from a governance perspective in the legal sector around grappling with generative AI, I think about data. I think about the mess that it is in large global corporations and law firms in particular. This is not to say that within each client matter there isn't brilliant documentation and understanding and classification and an ability to really dig into what has happened for each client on each matter. I'm saying that when it comes to the business and how it runs itself and who makes decisions, who is accountable, how do the business processes flow from one important layer of information through to another in accordance with a set of governing principles around the decision-making structures in an organization. That is a really immature discipline in I'd say a number of global law firms in particular. I think even in-house teams, large in-house teams within big global corporations, even if you're looking at a sort of general counsel and their teams, CLOs, and what they're grappling with, even then it's also a major point across the legal sector is how do decisions get made? What kind of decision-making principles have we got right at the top? And how does it then flow and trickle through? And how can we delegate responsibilities around decision-making in a nimble way? That is a real challenge, I think, for law firms, where I have certainly seen there is a persistence, a real tenacity around this concept that, only those few people who are really vested with, really trusted at the top to make decisions are being called upon to make decisions about almost everything. It's there is definitely a bit of a fear-based culture around, well, I don't want to ever get blamed for making a mistake, so I'm going to seek the decision has to be made by someone at the top so that I can say, well, it wasn't me, So that, I'm talking about some of the more practical issues, but I'm also I'm bringing it back to mindset within the leadership landscape and the structure.
So I'll go through a couple of bits of governance that I typically get involved with, but an observation there, and I've seen this in other disciplines as well, science, engineering. An observation is that one of the things I've seen a lot of folks talk about this in different sectors, and that is, as AI comes in, we need to focus on the human aspects, and the human aspects are going to be critical thinking, decision-making, judgment, negotiation, interpersonal skills, etc., etc. All of that kind of thing is what we are calling human. And then data processing, analysis, something, all of the things that we would say that AI does more effectively. Now, in all of the disciplines we're talking about, and we're talking particularly about the legal sector today, but if we have this paradigm where we say, or the culture where we say, well, decisions have to be made by the person at the top, there's no delegated authority. As if I'm not the guy at the top or the girl at the top, then if I'm not that person, I have no practice in decision-making when it's critical. Until I get to the point where I have to make critical decisions, and then I have no practice for my entire career.
Yes.
How do I get good at making decisions when they matter if I've never done it?
Well, this is the reason for the case that I make for a really fairly radical shift in the way in which leaders are trained and developed and helped and nurtured within these organizations in order to equip people in the ways that they need to be equipped for the challenges that they will face. Because naturally it's going to happen that whether or not the powers that be within these large organizations want it, they are going to need to change, because you mentioned a little earlier that, there's obviously an element here of the client educating themselves. Now, if we just bring it back to that for a second, the client has obviously access to ChatGPT and lots of new ways of being able to just go and ask, okay, am I asking the right questions of my of my lawyers that I'm hiring? Am I, how can I, all sorts of ways in which clients just took it as given before that what they were getting from a trusted advisor that they'd made a decision on hiring. There's a whole new paradigm of thinking around how am I getting value for money, because the general counsel client is absolutely being just so much pressure is on them for value for money as well in these current climes. And so obviously that pressure trickles down. Clients are being a lot more challenging around, what does value for money look like in this new era? How are you using are you doing it responsibly? But you have to be able to say, are you using it responsibly, and what does that actually mean? That's a huge topic, but you have to be able to say that you're using AI for most organizations now, because if you don't, then it immediately brands you as an organization that's still stuck in the dark ages. And so and you are automatically going to be charging a much higher rate than an organization that isn't using these tools. And so it's huge, the pressure that is already on law firms from clients to innovate. So I think the question is really around, so there's so much around leadership and how the whole business model is going to change. There is going to need to be more nimbleness. Now, we're not talking about turning every law firm into some kind of a Silicon Valley mimic. Like, obviously, there's just, let's be realistic here. What we're talking about is the ability to be able to pull from different levels of multidisciplinary and expertise in a way that there is more of a seamless story being told from different layers of expertise and different tools being able to integrate with each other in order to create better, more meaningful workflows that actually solve clients' problems. And in order to do that, there's going to need to be extremely good communication, much more transparency, and a lot better ways of being able to handle the human side of things, which is risk aversion. Like, how are we going to address the level of risk aversion, the level of lack of accountability amongst leaders? I would say that there's more pressure now. There is a new cohort of young solicitors and professionals. And I do want to just clarify, I'm specifically talking about the world of solicitors and not barristers, because that's a whole other kind of world to delve into. But where AI is also impacting the way that they work, but of course it's a very different kind of model I'm talking about there. There is a cohort of young, I'd say often, really innovative, a lot of examples of female leaders I've seen. Don't want to talk about age necessarily, but people who are, they haven't been in the workforce for as long as many who are currently in the sort of most powerful positions, and they are starting to make their way in these organizations, and they are demanding something different. They are providing something different for their teams. They are having open discussions, for example. I wish I could shout out names, but there are some fabulous people I've been working with there. They literally hold forums where they say, okay, let's really go over this with a fine-tooth comb. Let's do a mock court case around how we handled this matter. And I want you to throw things at me. Where did we go wrong? Did anything go wrong? If it did, let's have this totally open session. Let's record everything. Then let's do something about continuous improvement around it. Let's follow up and change things for the better. So that requires a level of vulnerability around a leader modeling what it looks like to be open to criticism, to be open to looking at things properly and then addressing them. And to also saying sometimes, sorry, I didn't get that right. Okay, so what can we really meaningfully do to ensure that there's a better upstream solution to this problem, so that if anyone like me is in the same position, or if I even make the same mistake again, that it's going to get caught earlier. That sort of mindset is starting to creep in. It's just nowhere near enough to cope with the level of radical sort of shift in leadership that's required, I think, for what is to come.
That's very interesting. And I think, so in the governance space, obviously you have all of these things like oversight and accountability and delegated authority and roles and responsibilities, and, having the right org structure in place, and maybe having somebody who looks at responsible AI principles or ethics or some of these things alongside organizational development, and how we might ensure that the human element and the AI element are working together synergistically to make sure that you get the best outcome without necessarily displacing the workforce completely. And there's obviously, fear and all of these kinds of things around job losses when it comes to AI. So there's that piece. There's also the piece around risk management, because we have the EU AI Act upon us in this area of the world, and that does have a risk-based framework. So if you are implementing things that can be making decisions around, for example, sentencing or anything like that, that's a very high-risk application. Whereas if you're looking at just data analysis, then I'm putting in, even if I'm not putting in any personal information, I'm just looking at the case law, the stuff that's out there, looking at the regulatory environment and what's out there, and doing that level of analysis. That's going to be a much lower risk application of artificial intelligence. So how mature, or how much have you seen in the legal space the application of any kind of risk management framework when it comes to AI implementation?
So it's there and it's happening, and I don't want to just talk about them as this big sort of nebulous kind of
the sector
cohort, but the law firms are investing in hiring people who have these skill sets, and they are opening up quite large sums of money for programs to look into, risk management for, and especially around data as well. There's quite a lot of money being thrown at it, and the hiring of fancy people. What I'm seeing is the inability of those wonderful experts to be able to really have any meaningful and efficient and effective impact within the timeframes that are needed, primarily because to really understand this entire landscape, you need the engagement of the lawyers. The trouble being there, and this is the same issue that is being faced around the innovation and the integration of AI tools within day-to-day operations within practice groups, is that currently speaking, there is still an incredibly strong impetus towards the lawyers, certainly the ones who have decision-making power and who could meaningfully input into the decisions that need to be made around these other big programs within business services and functions. They are not able to free up enough of their time to really input and spend some time grappling with what actually needs to be grappled with, because they are still under the incredible pressure for billable hours. And that pressure is, so this is the key thing that I see being a real challenge for how law firms are able to truly innovate, is that their best minds actually ought to be spending time on how are we innovating? How are we putting our minds together with these other people who we're hiring, actually giving them time and actually designing new ways of working, really understanding our data, really classifying it in ways that make sense for our business and for the external market? How are we really thinking about future needs and integrating our knowledge for how our internal landscape, legal landscape needs to operate in comparison with the rest of the market, and in comparison with what experts tell us is good governance for our business? So that synergy is not happening at the moment. And it's primarily because of the constraints of the pressure of billable hours.
So we mentioned earlier that you and I have both spent a little bit of time in consulting, and the pressures were the same for billable hours in consulting. And yes, the way I saw consulting firms deal with that was they would set up internal projects against which your best minds would be able to bill. And those would be still effectively, per practice, they would still be billable hours. But for the organization as a whole, that's how you get your innovation. And does that not happen in law firms?
It is happening.
Right.
And there's a lot of lip service being paid to giving people certain types of, additional roles or hats that they're wearing where, it will make them look good, right? To be able to say, oh, I'm part of this working group, I'm part of this, special committee that's looking at X, Y, and Z. What tends to happen, and I'm afraid it really is still a ubiquitous problem at the moment, is that there is just an awful lot of talking shops around excessive loops around talking about the same thing, and a real lack of rigor around what are we, even just basics around what problem are we trying to solve? What are the goals that we're setting for ourselves in an iterative way? Like, how can we actually be a little bit agile around this? Because we may set a target for ourselves. You can't deal in like yearly targets anymore. You have to be able to have a broad compass of where you're strategically going. But then it may be that things shift and change. Even that concept is quite different. But even just from meeting to meeting, being able to identify, well, what are we actually focusing on? What do we need to receive? What do we need to achieve as the output from this particular meeting? And how is it then going to serve our OKRs? Again, another foreign concept. It's that level is very, very difficult. So to get any kind of real movement happening, the momentum is just incredibly hard to happen. And also, the difference between the Big Four and law firms is that I think, just speaking from personal experience, they did actually put quite a lot of impetus and onus on if you were able to really contribute to the development of a point of view, the organization in Big Four is, making a big they're trying to actually productize their point of view in relation to the latest trends or whatever. And then they seek to publish that. They give you a name for it. They put you in the limelight. You can then go do speeches and you can go and, talk to others around it. You get some internal kudos around it, and you're really engaged in trying to stay up to date. And it really does actually add to your image and your promotion, likelihood of your promotion.
Yeah.
Prospect. And it is to some degree commodified in terms of what percentage of your time needs to be spent on that. And they're actually measuring it. And it is seen as a really important part of your job. What I've seen in law firms and even the more innovative ones is that actually there's a bit of lip service put to it, but there's no true metric put on how do you quantify if you're spending too much time on that and you're not meeting your billable hour, the daily amount of time, daily targets around how many billable hours you're clocking, that is still the primary metric. And any other stuff that you're doing is just a nice to have, to be honest, within the world of law. And so until there's a shift in truly freeing up some time for lawyers, I just don't see that level of really innovative engagement happening. Because what we need is the best minds, the ones who are the most successful with clients, who are able to bring in the best revenue. We actually need them to be putting their minds to internal processes and new ways of working and new ways of interacting with technology.
Absolutely. So I'm sure at some point we will come on to the types of use cases and the types of technologies that we could be using against the culture of innovation and a culture of using artificial intelligence. But one eye on the clock, right?
Yeah.
Let's think about what we've spoken about so far is the prevailing culture in the legal sector that potentially allows those who are hungry enough, because work is competitive, right? And some people do things, others don't do those things. And the people who do those things sometimes get ahead because they're hungry for it. So work is competitive. Now, in this backdrop of fairly vertical hierarchies, large power distance and power dynamics, and always you have the new generation coming in, whether that's people who've come from other careers or whether it's people who are graduates coming in. Age is not really a factor here. People are coming in using new tools, new technologies to try and change things, improve things, and potentially give more value to the client for less resource input, because that's really the goal of everything. So when we think about all of that in this kind of culture where, of course, it's the legal sector, we must be thinking about regulatory governance in there as well. Cobbler's children shouldn't have to wear shoes and all of this kind of thing. So we think about all of that. And regardless of the types of technology, which we'll come on to at a later date. But are there key messages or key things that you would like to, if you could unlock one door and suddenly the world of law and artificial intelligence would come together seamlessly into some kind of utopia? If you could unlock that one door or three doors, what would they be?
I think about some real practical examples of what has worked for me and has given me the greatest sense of efficacy and ability to really make some impact. It's where you get someone at the top who's already quite powerful in the world that they're in, and they're willing to put their neck on the line and actually really innovate and and really try new things. And I have seen that. What it requires and what has happened has been this ability to think through, okay, how am I engaging across my organization with a cross-functional way? So, and that starts with relationships. That starts with that leader having just a straight up one-to-one conversation, but ideally involving some people in the background like myself. I would get involved in these discussions where you're really trying to map out the relationship. First of all, you're trying to talk through the purpose of what you're trying to do in sort of, I'm going to use a really terrible term here, but supercharge the collaboration between certain functions and different practice areas. You're getting that relationship right at the top, the buy-in right at the top. You're building trust right at the top. And then you're asking for those other leaders to provide you with a delegated person who they trust to be their sort of operational or project lead on a particular angle that you're trying to really create innovation around. This is basic stuff. This is not rocket science. This is about relationships. So that's the very key. That's the very start. And having delegated power structures and communication channels that are set for specific purposes. And then that there's a way of monitoring the progress of how that relationship actually works. And there it comes into the world of OKRs and how to actually start to look at what is our strategy? What exactly are we trying to achieve? What are the primary sort of priority areas for us? Let's not boil the ocean. Let's not throw the kitchen sink at it. Let's focus on doing one thing well and then iterating and then moving on to the next thing and doing and using that, creating a success story to then create something new in the next realm. And so there tends to be this, and I did start to see that happening in certain spaces where, this real understanding of excellent strategic execution and what that looks like was starting to make a difference. So I don't know if that gives you a little bit of a flavor. It's all to do with, the people side of strategic execution and beginning to involve people from the bottom up as well as from the top down at the same time.
And I think that tracks with a lot of the things that I see across learning and development and across human capital management, where, stakeholder management, identifying the drivers for the business and having that stakeholder influence is very important. But at the same time, having a purposeful portfolio of technology implementations that address business problems and can be piloted and then dropped, fail fast, if they don't work, such that you eventually you sharpen what you're doing and start to add value to the business. That message seems to be consistent across industries, regardless of where we are.
It is, and we just need the ability to. What I would say is what I've seen is the ability. So certain law firms have in the past tried to put quite a lot of money into innovation programs, but what has happened is that there has been a reluctance to drop that program when it's not proving to actually, have returns. And that is one of the key factors. I'm massively, I'm a huge follower of Annie Duke and, understanding more about the science of decision making and, how do we make decisions about when to quit, the sunk cost fallacy and all of that. There's a huge barrier for law firms in particular, because there is this very strong assumption if we've put a lot of money into something, we just have to make it work, right? We just have to make it work. We will bash it on the head until it works. And then only when somebody very brave comes along, and raises the right questions, do you eventually get a decision to call it quits on something so that you can then start something new. This is a big mindset shift. The small experimentation of things in small pockets and the ability to fail fast and say, okay, this is not working, let's move on to the next thing. That is a whole new world for law firms and definitely needs to become much more practical.
Absolutely. So, Jacqui Woodall, thank you very much for today's conversation.
It's my pleasure.
Hopefully we will have another conversation on use cases and culture and skills at some point in the future. But for today, thank you very much.
Great to be here. Thanks.